The Meta-Nexus Institute is a global network of scholars, scientists, clergy, and citizens pursuing the constructive engagement of science, religion, philosophy, and the humanities. At colleges, universities, and their communities around the world, we promote interdisciplinary, interinstitutional, and interreligious exploration and education. For more information, visit www.metanexus.net.
Our final speaker is Thomas Fowler, founder and president of the Xavier Zubiri Foundation in North America. Thomas serves as editor of two journals, Xavier Zubiri Review and the Telecommunications Review. He is the author of over 100 articles, papers, and reviews. He has translated 2 books of Zubiri's writings. His own book, The Evolution Controversy, A Survey of Competing Theories, was published in 2007 by Baker Academic Press. Thomas also serves as adjunct professor in the Electrical and Computer Engineering School at George Mason University, where he teaches graduate courses in optics and optical communications. He has a doctorate in Systems and Control Theory from the George Washington University, a Master's of Science from Columbia, a Bachelor's of Science in Electrical Engineering, and a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from the University of Maryland, College Park. He is also Senior Principal Scientist in the Center for Information Technology and Telecommunications of Nobles Incorporated, a not-for-profit consulting firm working entirely in the public interest. And Thomas Fowler's paper will be on personal causality and the science-religion dialogue.
Okay, thank you, Kathy.
You might want to go back.
So the subject of this paper is causality and personal causality and how it impacts the science-religion dialogue. I'm going to first give a little introduction to the subject and a little bit of discussion of causality and how it...
Be sure to talk into the microphone.
Yeah.
I think they're having a hard
causality and how it interacts with knowledge. And then we'll discuss Zubiri's understanding of causality and how he's able to resolve some of the traditional problems of causality. And then we'll look at personal causality and its impact on the science-religion dialogue. Now, the reason this subject is of interest is that the apparent conflict between science and religion is often viewed and argued with respect to the question of whether God exists. Typically people deal with this question of God's existence by means of proofs. The idea is that if you can show that God exists, that God must exist, then therefore science can't dispense with either God or with theology, and that would solve the question once and for all. Typically these demonstrations utilize the notion of causality, and as such they require a particular philosophical framework. Now the problem with this is that, as everyone in this room is well aware, I'm sure, that causality has been controversial, extremely controversial, at least since the time of Hume. And that automatically means that the proofs using it are likewise going to be controversial. So the question is, can causality still be useful in the context of proofs of the existence of God? Now, causality has been fundamental in the history of philosophy because it encapsulates a lot of key notions that we would like to have. If you think about the traditional notion of causality, it involves the ideas of contiguity, necessary connection, uniformity, real production of effects. These are the things people associate with causality. Now, if you look at we'll just spend a few slides here discussing the history of causality. This slide's a bit hard to read, but basically we can divide causality into at least 5 phases, which I'll discuss in a little more detail. The first phase is causality as a principle of nature, and that lasted pretty much up through the Middle Ages. The second phase is causality as a principle of knowing, which took over more or less with Descartes. The third phase was the philosophical crisis of causality that began with Hume. The fourth phase was what we might call the scientific crisis of causality that began with the 20th century developments such as quantum mechanics. And I think there's a fifth phase here where we can resolve some of the problems of the earlier phases. Now the first phase, causality as a principle of nature, is what we might call the metaphysical phase. In this phase, causality is taken as a principle of nature in the sense of how things work. It therefore becomes the basis for all knowledge, which is assumed to be of causes, and it becomes the fundamental explanatory paradigm for any type of science. It is assumed to be a universally valid principle, and therefore it can be used to reason from direct experience to realms that are far removed from experience. It's therefore used in natural theology to discuss the existence of God, and it is, as you probably are well aware, the ground of the cosmological argument. The nature of efficient causality, which is what is primarily of interest, is that the efficient causality actually produces the effect that we see. It doesn't merely precede or accompany it, but it actually generates the effect. It causes do this because they have the means of a force or a capacity to produce this effect. And so there is a necessary link between the cause and effect. Given the cause, the effect has to occur. And the nature of the link means that given certain effects, you can infer the existence and nature of the cause. As a metaphysical principle, therefore, causality is that everything that happens has to have a cause. This is the universality and essence of causal explanations. Causality is, in that sense, a metaphysical principle that has universal applicability, as I mentioned, and it is used to make inferences about things such as the existence of God that we cannot directly experience. Given the time limitations here, I won't go over this slide in detail, but the basic idea is that in order to get this notion of causality, you really have to have a lot of background in terms of experience and inference. So it's not quite as obvious as it seems. You need certain experience of cause and effect from one source or another. You have to determine that it applies to all experience, that it applies to all happenings, and other metaphysical assumptions. And just as an example, if you look at Aquinas' proofs, they tend to be oriented towards causality in some way. For example, the first proof has to do with the prime mover. You need, and the effort of this proof is to establish the existence of a first mover or a first cause, and thereby establish the existence of God. Now, I assume people here are familiar with that, so I won't go over the proof, but just a couple comments on it. The proof doesn't actually refer to the simple fact of change in the cosmos. It's actually based on the fact that change involves passing from potency to act, and that any such change requires something that's in a state of actuality, which would then cause this reduction from potency to act. And this leads to the notion of a first mover or first cause. But the problem is that the idea of change as a passing from potency to act is an interpretation of change, not change itself. There are other possible interpretations of change. Change doesn't have to be considered a state of a changing thing. Okay, and things may not even be separable in the Aristotelian sense. Okay, there are a number of problems with the idea of causality as a principle of nature. Now, the second phase of causality was when it was used more as a principle of knowing. This began with the continental rationalist Descartes in particular, and with the English empiricists. And the focus of causality during this phase shifted from investigation of things and change to justifying our knowledge about the world. That obviously was, as you know, Descartes' main focus, as the other speakers have mentioned. The notion of causality was still accepted more or less intact from classical philosophy, but it was used differently. To establish the existence of God, the thinkers didn't so much rely on causality. They used reasoning that didn't really require causes in the world, so they often relied, such as Descartes, on the ontological argument. They were, however, interested in the question of what causes our ideas and how we can be sure they tell us about the world. For Descartes, there were, of course, the two substances, the res cogitans and the res extensa, and the cogito does not directly give us knowledge about the world, and this was a problem that Descartes had. So Descartes has to invoke God to guarantee the causal link from the outside world to our ideas about it. Later, Malebranche, as you know, developed the theory of occasionalism, in which God causes the ideas in my mind to change as the world changes. Spinoza argued there was really only one substance, not the two that Descartes had determined, but he also said God is a direct cause of the ideas in my mind. And Leibniz, with his metaphysics of monads, needed to rely, which were incommunicable, needed to rely on a pre-established harmony in which God causes me to have ideas about the world that are exactly synchronized with what's actually going on out there. In the empiricist tradition, you had a different emphasis, but the same basic concern. For Locke, things in nature cause a perception in the mind, and we still need to invoke God in order to tell us that we have true ideas about the world. Berkeley, as an extreme nominalist, said, well, you really can't compare things and ideas, so he rejects the idea of material things altogether and just says, well, God directly causes our ideas of the world. So we're still back to causality, giving us knowledge, guaranteeing our knowledge of the world. Now, with Hume, a different situation arose. Hume was also a nominalist, but he felt that because ideas are separable, things are so likewise. Therefore, you can't really argue that there's any such thing as causality in the classical sense. No cause is linked by necessity to any effect, or at least not in any way we can know about. All we have is constant conjunction of ideas. Therefore, metaphysical knowledge based on causality is impossible, as the other speakers have mentioned, and I'm sure everyone in this room is aware. There are a number of problems with Hume's analysis that we won't get into today. First of all, not all cases of constant conjunction are causal, and second, many cases of causality can be inferred from a single instance. But leaving that aside, you see the basic situation with Hume. Now, Kant accepted most of Hume's analysis, but he thought that Hume went too far. He said, well, we really do have some knowledge of the world, and we really do know something about causal relations, or there are causes and effects. So he reestablished knowledge by his theory of the synthetic activity of the mind. Causality becomes the way that the mind thinks about things in the world. But the problem is that things conform to the mind, not the other way around, so therefore you can't use causality to infer knowledge about God and other things outside of the mind. Now, if for Kant we can't know things in themselves, a Ding an sich, therefore we can't discuss necessary connections, power of production of reality, real production of effects, and causes and effects with respect to reality. Therefore, proofs of the existence of God are based on causality are invalid. But in the realm of morality, Kant did note that causality is still an absolute truth because we have knowledge of ourselves as a Ding an sich that we really don't have of things out in the world. So for him, God's existence can't be based on the traditional cosmological proofs, but has to come from some datum of morality. And the same is true of the immortality of the soul. All right. Now, the fourth phase of causality was what we might call the scientific crisis. This arose in the 1920s with the development of quantum mechanics. For quantum mechanics, there was this revolution, as you know, that because the deterministic model of nature from the 16th to the 19th centuries had to be discarded. This was a double blow to the classical ideas of science because you had deterministic laws replaced by statistical laws, and you had exact boundary conditions replaced by boundary conditions that had simply a lower bound of uncertainty. This had a number of implications which would be interesting to discuss, but we can't get into here with respect to, for example, reductionism. But in any case, it meant that the traditional idea of causes as they applied in classical physics didn't really work very well anymore. This led to a great debate between two factions, the Copenhagen school, which said that at the deepest level the world really is indeterminate, and therefore traditional causality ideas are only an approximation. This was Bohr and Heisenberg. The other school maintained that the world is determinate, that the meaning of science is so bound up with the traditional notion of causality that we can't really abandon it without abandoning science. And they felt that maybe some hidden parameters would be found that would restore the determinism that we were used to from classical physics. This was, of course, the school of Einstein and de Broglie and others. The debate on this problem, which was fairly acrimonious and that went on for quite some time, led to the formulation of the famous EPR paradox dealing with the non-locality problem, a type of action at a distance. EPR is the first initials of Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, who developed this paradox. And in this paradox, two different interpretations of quantum mechanics, namely the Heisenberg school and the de Broglie-Einstein school, gave different results for a certain thought experiment. And for a long time, people thought that no real test of this was possible, but Bell, who was working at CERN, a British physicist, developed a set of inequalities based on the EPR, and the critical experiment was formulated and done by Alain Aspect and his group at the University of Paris in 1982, and the result was a confirmation of the Copenhagen school. Okay, well, given this situation, can we really make any sense out of it? And in Zubiri's view, all the sides were partially correct, and nobody really saw the complete picture. The cause of the problems was really the confusion of three related things. Causality in the strict sense, that is, real influence of the cause on the effect. Another concept which he calls functionality, which actually covers most of the cases that we usually use the term causality for. And a third thing, power. Okay. What Zubiri says was, well, Hume and Kant were partially right. Experience doesn't give us direct knowledge of real production. What that does give us knowledge of is functional relations between things or among things. And the notion is analogous to function in mathematics, for example, y equals x squared. The nature of functional relationships can be quite varied. They can be deterministic, they can be probabilistic, they can involve symmetry. They don't necessarily have to involve causality in the traditional sense. The traditional view of causality is correct, but only in a limited area, and that's because only humans are really substances in the traditional sense, in Zubiri's view. Kant was correct in this sense that morality is a datum of experience of a different type than the others, than other empirical data. In that case, in the case of morality, we do perceive the real influence of our actions. So in that sense, morality is based on the fact that causality in the traditional sense is still valid for the human realm. With respect to power, Zubiri says that causality is functionality, but power is dominance of the real. This was confused with causality in the traditional notion. It's not exactly the same because dominance is not necessarily something that's deterministic as traditional causality was. But the notion does become important when you do certain theological analyses, such as of the sacraments, which have real power to convey. Roughly speaking, you have causality divided into functionality, and in a subcategory functionality is traditional causality, and then you have this power of the real. All these three things have been confused under the notion of causality in the past. So causality is unnecessary to account for our perception of reality. Reality is given to us in Zubiri's view because intelligence is sentient. If you were at my presentation on Monday, we discussed this. Metaphysical knowledge is possible but not dependent on any particular causal principle. Causality in the strong deterministic sense is really irrelevant for most knowledge. It's never was actually verified, but was always only sketched out as a program. And Hume was right that we can't directly perceive the influence of one thing on another, except, as I mentioned, in respect to human affairs. in general, the causal nexus is simply too complicated to unravel, and if you take any case of that and think it through, you would realize that there are so many variables involved that even in the case of throwing a ball and breaking a window, that you can see the difficulty of the problem. Classical causality is based on the notion of, Aristotelian notion basically, of separable things and substances, and though it may not actually be possible to separate the things, actually for some of the reasons that the previous speaker discussed. For Zubiri, reality is open and respective, a field-like, as it was for Whitehead, not something that's closed. Okay. Also, in Zubiri's view, we need to distinguish the content and the formality of reality. For Zubiri, the real locus of causality is formality, not content, which is where everybody was looking for it before. Also, ordinary knowledge, as I mentioned, only requires functionality, doesn't require causality in the strong sense. And most knowledge that we have these days comes from methods, such as the scientific method, that don't really invoke causality in the traditional sense at all. Hume was correct that the world can't be perceived, but he erred because he didn't actually think through, I'm not going to get into analysis of Hume here, but he didn't really think through how we perceive the world, and he didn't understand causality as a type of functionality. He was trying to shoehorn it into the traditional sense. Now, for Zubiri, as I mentioned, causality really exists in the traditional way with respect to morality, and for him, it occurs in a couple of forms. For him, he believes that between persons there is this type of strict causality, and this implies moral obligation and moral responsibility. For example, if we make statements, John murdered Bill or John robbed the bank, these statements go beyond a simple report of what happened. In the first case, we're saying that John knew what would happen when he pulled the trigger on the gun. John knew that a certain reality would be produced, namely the death of Bill, and that he willed this to happen. Okay. So this is something that does involve a definite production of reality. But it goes in a sense beyond traditional causality because it's irreducible to a strictly rational explanation of the world. It involves some other type of perception of the world. There is this, it can't be reduced to the concept of a scientific law either, because it involves concepts that go beyond what can be expressed in scientific laws. Okay. Now, this expanded idea of personal causality may seem peculiar because we're accustomed to a completely different use and notion of causality. But anybody who has experienced deep friendship or seen how unselfish actions on the part of someone else, say a good person, can radically transform other people, how they think, and make life-changing experiences in them, will immediately grasp the concept of personal causality. Now, it does involve a certain production of reality, obviously, in that way, because real changes are produced in other people. Lives can be radically altered by this experience of contact with a good person. And life works and example can be inspired, and may have been inspired in you, in ways that no rational argument would be able to do. Now, to get back to the question of God, which is what we started with, if you can't really do these demonstrations in the traditional way, then what can you do? Well, God really needs to be known in another way through some sort of personal experience, and Zubiri's approach is that you want to base those demonstrations as much as possible on direct personal experience of reality rather than reasoning based on complex rational systems that can change over time and are subject to a number of objections. Zubiri really believes that the earlier efforts to establish the existence of God through these rational arguments really tried to do too much at one time. We rather need to look first at our basic experience, which is of the power of the real, We experience reality as a power, as a force out there. And for Zubiri, each person is turned towards that reality, which is something that is other than him, more than the person on which he is based. And this reality supplies the resources that he needs to carry out the process of making himself into a person. This is what Zubiri terms relegation, which means turning towards something else that's not found among what you might call the material things immediately given. It's something that's sought beyond them, and that is a fact of human life observable by anyone. This doesn't directly give us God, but only what we call the realm of the deity. God usually involves some further explanation at a higher level. For theists, this is the first step in reaching God. For agnostics and atheists, some other explanation of the experience has to be created. So you have these two paths here that get us to the deity. You have the path of personal causality, which says, okay, there's some reality of other people, and then you have this path of relegation, the power of the real, which tells us that there's some force out there beyond us. Okay, now in this view, God no longer is a cosmological object such as a prime mover, first cause, or a superphysicist who rules the universe by invoking physical laws. God is not a concept or a terminus of a reasoning process or any sort of reality object such as a chair or a mountain or a star or a galaxy. God is a reality ground, and man's life is woven in his experience with things, and this experience is itself an experience of God. So in each making his own life, each man configures or disfigures God in himself. So God then becomes much more indwelling rather than something out there somewhere. Okay, and just to, I believe this is the last slide, just to conclude here, I have a quote from Zubiri's book, El Hombre de Dios, which we're putting a translation of out later this year. To help, to console, to listen are not mere psychic phenomena, but are the metaphysical forms through which God is constituting me in my being. Because of this, each human being, whether he or she knows it or not, has the experience of God. This is not the empirical experience of an object, but a metaphysical experience of the ground of his or her personal being. This experience is in itself the experience of God. God is something experienced. So this, the impact on the science-religion dialogue is that the contradiction between science and religion has been based on this crucial assumption that it's a debate between two equals and that both are rational explanations of the world or can be in conflict. And cosmological arguments are especially vulnerable to changes in our understanding of nature brought about by advances in science. This makes theology something of a follower of science. But there are a couple of problems here, and if you understand theology and science in the way I have indicated here, you change the whole basis for the discussion, and therefore you can get over this conflict between science and religion, at least with respect to the demonstrations of God. Okay. I might mention theistic evolution as an example. It's based on the theory there are aspects of our experience of reality that are not accessible to science, and it can't be meaningfully expressed in scientific terms. The notion of personal causality and the power of the real shows that this is a viable approach. Both are based on human experience prior to rational explanation of the world. Thank you.
Thank you.